Scarlet Rot is usually described as a curse, a disease, a divine affliction, something unnatural that invades a body, destroys it, and leaves only decay behind. But what if that understanding is completely wrong? What if Scarlet Rot is not simply a force of death, but a force of replacement? Because the most horrifying possibility in Elden Ring is not that the rot kills life. It is that the rot may actually be a complete ecosystem, one with its own logic, its own growth, its own form of reproduction, and its own vision of what life should become. And if that is true, then Scarlet Rot is not a punishment. It is nature, just not ours. When people think about Scarlet Rot, they usually think in moral terms. It is corruption, blasphemy, a stain, a sickness associated with suffering, deformity, and divine horror. And that makes sense. Everything about the rot is framed through pain. It consumes bodies. It warps landscapes. It spreads through contact. It transforms living things into grotesque versions of themselves. But the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to describe Scarlet Rot as simple destruction. Because the rot does not merely erase. It grows. It flowers. It adapts. It creates new forms. And everywhere it spreads, it does something very strange. It does not leave emptiness behind. It builds a new environment. So in this video, I want to explore a darker possibility. Scarlet Rot is not just a plague. It is an ecosystem, a self-propagating biological order that does not exist to end life, but to overwrite it. The word curse implies something important. It implies that Scarlet Rot is external to the natural order. A curse is an intrusion, a violation, something imposed from outside the world's normal logic. But Scarlet Rot does not behave like an interruption. It behaves like a system. Think about what the rot actually does. It infects hosts. It spreads across terrain. It alters local biology. It produces visible stages of growth. It creates recurring imagery of blooming, sprouting, secretion, and transformation. These are not the signs of a force whose only purpose is annihilation. They are the signs of a life process. Even the language surrounding Scarlet Rot points in this direction. Not just decay, but flowering. Not just corruption, but blooming. Not just disease, but rebirth through alteration. And that distinction matters, because a poison kills, a fire destroys, a curse ruins, but an ecosystem replaces one order with another. That is what makes Scarlet Rot so unsettling. It does not feel like pure entropy. It feels organized. It has patterns, stages, hosts, environments where it thrives, and visible outcomes that repeat often enough to suggest design, or at least biological logic. In other words, Scarlet Rot behaves less like a supernatural punishment and more like an invasive life form operating at every level of the world at once. The next clue is the way Scarlet Rot interacts with the body. A normal disease weakens the organism. It drains energy, breaks tissue, and eventually causes death. But Scarlet Rot often seems to do something beyond simple degeneration. It transforms. Bodies touched by the rot are not merely damaged. They are redefined. Their movement changes. Their structure changes. Their relationship to pain, growth, and survival changes. And that suggests that the rot is not just feeding on life. It is using life as raw material. That is an important biological shift. A parasite exploits the host. An infection colonizes a host. But a system-level organism, something more like a fungal network, an invasive ecology, or a total biological regime, does something more ambitious. It turns the host into infrastructure. The body stops being an individual organism and becomes a site of production, a site of spread, a site of transformation. This is why Scarlet Rot feels so much more disturbing than ordinary fantasy disease. It does not simply make you die. It makes your body participate in the life cycle of something else. And in that sense, the true horror of Scarlet Rot is not pain. It is loss of biological sovereignty. Your cells, your flesh, your future, none of it belongs entirely to you anymore. The rot does not only consume the body, it recruits it. The next clue is the way Scarlet Rot interacts with the body. A normal disease weakens the organism. It drains energy, breaks tissue, and eventually causes death. But Scarlet Rot often seems to do something beyond simple degeneration. It transforms. Bodies touched by the rot are not merely damaged. They are redefined. Their movement changes. Their structure changes. Their relationship to pain, growth, and survival changes. And that suggests that the rot is not just feeding on life. It is using life as raw material. That is an important biological shift. A parasite exploits the host. An infection colonizes a host. But a system-level organism, something more like a fungal network, an invasive ecology, or a total biological regime, does something more ambitious. It turns the host into infrastructure. The body stops being an individual organism and becomes a site of production, a site of spread, a site of transformation. This is why Scarlet Rot feels so much more disturbing than ordinary fantasy disease. It does not simply make you die. It makes your body participate in the life cycle of something else. And in that sense, the true horror of Scarlet Rot is not pain. It is loss of biological sovereignty. Your cells, your flesh, your future, none of it belongs entirely to you anymore. The rot does not only consume the body, it recruits it. One of the most important recurring images connected to Scarlet Rot is the flower. That image is doing a lot of work. A flower is not just a decoration of nature. It is a reproductive structure, a signal that an organism has reached a stage in its life cycle where it can spread, attract, propagate, and continue itself. So when Scarlet Rot is associated again and again with blooming, the implication is difficult to ignore. Blooming suggests maturation. It suggests that rot is not merely an event of damage, but a process with developmental stages. Something begins, something grows, something flowers, and after flowering comes dispersal. This matters because it frames Scarlet Rot not as static corruption, but as living succession. There's a timeline to it, a sequence, an unfolding biological intention, and flowers do something else symbolically. They make violence look natural. That is part of what gives Scarlet Rot its uniquely unsettling identity. It is grotesque, but not chaotic. Beautiful, but only in the way certain poisonous things are beautiful. Its imagery suggests that destruction and fertility are somehow fused together. That tension is at the core of the rot. It is death presented in the language of life, or maybe worse, a new life presented through the remains of the old one. We usually treat contamination as passive. Something dirty enters a clean system and causes harm. But Scarlet Rot may be better understood as a competitor species, or perhaps a competitor principle of life itself, because it does not merely exist inside the world. It contests the world. It enters existing biological and social orders and subjects them to another set of rules, different tolerances, different outcomes, different definitions of viability. And that is why so many things touched by the rot feel uncanny. They are not just failing to remain what they were, they are becoming fit for something else. In evolutionary terms, that is a terrifying possibility, because it suggests that Scarlet Rot is not hostile to life in general. It is hostile to specific forms of life that belong to the previous order. And once you see it that way, the rot starts to resemble a selective pressure, an environment that favors some forms, destroys others, and pushes a world toward a different biological future. This would explain why rot never feels like simple absence. It feels directional, as if it is trying to produce a world in its own image. And if that's true, then the real opposite of Scarlet Rot is not health. It is resistance to ecological replacement. This is where Scarlet Rot becomes more than biology. Because in Elden Ring, biological horror is rarely separate from the divine. The gods, outer powers, and cosmic forces of the world do not stand above flesh. They work through flesh. They alter it, claim it, reshape it. That means Scarlet Rot may represent something more profound than infection. It may represent a rival vision of nature itself. Not a glitch in creation, but a competing creation, a sacred ecology from outside the human idea of order. And that is exactly why characters and cultures in the world experience it as abomination. Not because it is unreal, but because it is too real in the wrong direction. Scarlet Rot threatens more than survival. It threatens classification. It blurs the line between disease and reproduction, between decay and growth, between punishment and adaptation, between the end of life and the beginning of another one. That is what divine horror often is in Elden Ring, not the destruction of reality, but the revelation that reality was never built for us alone. A plague is terrifying because it can kill you. Scarlet Rot is more terrifying because it may not need to stop there. If it is an ecosystem, then death is only one stage of its process. What matters more is transition. The body becomes substrate. The land becomes habitat. Pain becomes mechanism. Blooming becomes propagation. That means the true fear of Scarlet Rot is not mortality. It is succession. The fear that your body, your home, your world, even your concept of life itself can be gradually replaced by something that is not technically dead, not technically broken, but fundamentally no longer yours. And that kind of horror hits much deeper than ordinary corruption, because it suggests that the world can continue after you, while using your remains as part of its next design. Scarlet Rot is not frightening because it ends life. It is frightening because it may be perfectly capable of beginning one.